Welcome once again to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm Mike Goodpaster. I'm your host for On This Day, and today we're going to talk about January 6, 1980. That would be the controversial Renfro catch, no catch in the 1979 AFC Championship game with the Pittsburgh Steelers eventually beating the Houston Oilers 27-13. Now, sometimes the drama of a one-sided playoff football game is so minimal that announcers feel compelled to invent it themselves. And I think this was the case in that 1979 AFC Championship game, when all four broadcasters for the NBC crew, Dick Enberg, Merlin Olsen, Mike Adamle, and Bryant Gumbel, permanently marred a glorious victory and signature moment of perhaps history's greatest football team by strongly implying that the game was decided by officiating. Now, ever since Dan Pastorini threw incomplete, officially, to Mike Renfro late in the third quarter, this game has only been remembered for one play, and to this day carries a false taint instigated by a jaded network crew desperate to avoid a repeat of the previous year's 34-5 blowout between the same two clubs. Now, the public gets a large amount of its perceptions from broadcasters, whether we like it or not, and normally in instances of sports controversy, announcers usually take the high road. Number one, to avoid the embarrassment of possibly being wrong. And number two, to avoid slighting the team receiving the favorable outcome and coming across as picking sides. That Mike Adamle, early in his broadcasting career, would deliver one of the worst post-game productions in the history of televised football is perhaps understandable. That A-list game caller, though, Dick Enberg, would declare the officials were Pittsburgh homers, and that he, and still early in his booth career, Merlin Olsen, would succumb to barstool-like conclusions on the spot represents the frustration of the late 70s dominance of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the popularity of the underdog Houston Oilers, the very long odds of Houston winning this game, and the expectation with the Dallas Cowboys already out of the playoffs that Super Bowl 14 could be a pointless exercise when it comes to TV ratings. Now remember, in the NFC Championship game, you had the Rams and the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers were hosting it. This was the first game of the day. The Buccaneers and Rams would be the second game. And if Houston won this game and Tampa Bay won, you'd have had a Super Bowl at that time against Houston against Tampa Bay. Now, the truth is that the pass to Renfro remains the most borderline important call in championship game history. The disputed element witnessed by side judge Don Orr, the movement of the ball in Mike Renfro's hands, is not seen on network coverage, but only in the perfect view provided by the NFL Films photographer, unavailable till well after the game was over. Now, under the standards of the 1970s, which allowed a ridiculous score by the Cowboys' Butch Johnson in Super Bowl 12, it probably should have been ruled a touchdown. Under today's review standards, I don't think it would have held up. Now, almost certainly a major factor in the call was the down, and people forget this. It was first and goal at the 5-yard line. Orr most likely was not expecting to see a fade route come his way on that snap. And I know expectations aren't part of the job of an official, but they undeniably happened. And Jim Tunney's crew would have been cognizant that awarding a possibly unearned touchdown on first down could be a lot more traumatic than the alternative, assuming Houston was able to punch it in and render the Renfro pass irrelevant, which they could have, which nobody ever brings up. Yet, Houston's reaction to the call betrays the team's own perceptions of his chances to win the game. Instead of coolly lining up for the next play as confident teams would, everyone from Mike Renfro to head coach Bum Phillips laid into the officials. Unglued is an accurate description. The next two plays were downright pathetic. They ran a handoff to Tim Wilson, who was a fullback, not very quick, up the middle into a defensive line with Joe Green for no gain. They threw a swing pass to Rob Carpenter several yards behind the line of scrimmage, then a field goal. It was successful, but still a winnable game. They made it 17-13. Now, Houston's reaction undoubtedly inspired NBC outrage. And here is exactly how Enberg and Olsen described this play. I have this game on a old VHS tape converted to DVD, but this is what the two announcers said right after that. Enberg on the play starts off with, "It is Renfro, touchdown," or is it out of play? Olsen says, "I don't think he could see the play. He looked down the end zone line to ask for a call from the other official. He didn't get a call." Olsen goes on to say, "Let's see if the feet come down. Now he's got the ball." He does. Enberg screams, "Touchdown! It's a touchdown." It was not called one, but there is no doubt that was a Houston touchdown. Olsen chimes in, "Now there's no question about this. He's got control. He has both feet down clearly in the end zone. It is a touchdown." There is no question on that one. It's a touchdown. Olsen continues on. What may be the most critical play of this game, a touchdown, has been taken away from Dan Pastorini and Mike Renfro. Enberg says, instead of 7 that they earned, now the Oilers must have to try for 3. Now that's home field advantage. And then he said, there's home field advantage, and then there's home field advantage. What may be a play that we talk about for years to come. And obviously, it is, because we're in 2020 and we're talking about it today, 40 years later. How devastating actually was this call to the Houston Oilers' chances of winning the game? A lot of people miss the fact that this was a game that was completely dominated by the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers actually fell behind early, like 7-0 on a Vernon Perry interception that was returned for a touchdown. In the first half, the Steelers outgained the Oilers 251 yards to 99. Earl Campbell rushed 15 yards on 17 carries. Oilers quarterbacks completed 4 passes to wide receivers. 2 of those were fumbled, and 15 passes to running backs in the games. The entire Houston offense amounted to 1 drive each half, limping down the field with screens and dump-off passes to running backs. The disputed pass to Renfro was preceded by a miracle third-down jump ball by Ronnie Coleman along the other sideline, and, securing anything but a convincing touchdown. So, no touchdowns basically scored in this game, except for this one. By halftime, they were lucky to be in the game at all. It was 17-10, and like I said, the Oilers jumped out, scored a touchdown early. The Steelers came back and answered with a 17-3 run. They missed a chance in the final seconds to post an insurmountable lead due to a questionable clock management and a bad 40-yard miss by kicker Matt Barr. In 2 consecutive AFC Championship games, the Oilers' offense scored a total of 0 offensive touchdowns and 3 total field goals. As Enberg and Olsen decided the Renfro pass should be forefront on viewers' minds the rest of the game, Bryant Gumbel and Mike Adamle not only grabbed a baton for the postgame, but they escalated it. Gumbel summarized the game with, "It was the touchdown that wasn't." What a great wordsmith Bryant Gumbel is. He added falsely of a game with a 251-99 halftime yardage differential, it was tight all the way, which is why the play looms so big. Pastorini throws what is a touchdown pass to Mike Renfro. Watch the feet. Both feet come down in bounds, Gumbel continues. There's no doubt that number 82 has both feet down. Adamle in the Steelers' locker room begins with the assignment of trying to coax words out of Chuck Noll, which is not a particularly easy job in any situation, but doable with a coach who's seen this situation so many times. Adamle called the game another successful victory in the AFC Championship and barely waited till the second question to put Noll on the spot. And the second question to Noll was, it seems historically a lot of AFC Championship games have been decided by controversial calls. That is an utterly bogus statement by Adamle. There was not a lot. There was a grand total of 1 AFC championship game affected by a controversial call. And that would have been 1977 between Denver and Oakland. That call was a blatant miss of a Rob Lytle fumble about a yard and a half short of the goal line that was obscured for officials by a pile of bodies. Neither that call nor certainly the Renfro call decided either game. Today, Mike Renfro caught a ball over Ron Johnson. Where were you when that call was made? Adamle asked a bewildered Chuck Noll. Chuck Noll's answer, and he laughed when he answered, was, I was on the sideline. I have no idea what happened. Adamle goes on to ask, do you think officials are conscious of the fact that there was an onside kick in that game in the Astrodome that went against you? Maybe making up for a call like that, Adamle said. So he's conspiracy theorizing at its worst, but also, why would officials that weren't even doing that game try to make up for a regular season Monday night game at the Astrodome over a month earlier? And Chuck Noll goes on to say, I have no idea. Why? Was it a bad call? And Noll hadn't seen it, and Adamle told him from about 4 different angles it was, obvious touchdown. But I don't think it tarnishes the victory at all. Noll grimaced, and that was the end. Was anything really tarnished? Gumble took the helm again, and being the arrogant guy that he is, chipped in. Indeed, from all different angles, it did look like a Houston touchdown, but it'll never appear in the books. Moments later, Adamle spoke with pool reporter Vito Stanelli of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who was granted an interview earlier with Jim Tunney, who was the head referee. And Vito goes on to say, I talked to Jim Tunney, the referee. He said decide Judge Donald Orr ruled that while Renfro's 2 feet came down in bounds, he did not have possession of the ball when his feet were in bounds. He didn't have possession until after he went out of the end zone. And he said the conference was because he wanted to get the call right. He checked with the other officials to see if anybody else had a better view. Now, Gumble insisted, our replay leads us to believe otherwise. Now, writing in Sports Illustrated, Paul Zimmerman described the decision as the cop-out call, then printed every complaint from the Houston Oilers franchise ever. Renfro says, I wasn't juggling it. There was no argument at all. And that is blatantly false. If you go look up and find the NFL Films footage that shows him, he didn't have possession of the ball until he was out of the back of the end zone. Now, Coach Bum Phillips, who on the sideline railed at the refs for signaling incomplete, admitted to Zimmerman, I couldn't see whether he was in bounds or not. I couldn't tell whether he juggled the ball or not. Then, resorting to the most insincere of gripes, claimed what really bothered him wasn't the truth of the play, but the procedure for assessing it. That's not important. The big problem is that the officials who work the playoffs have no experience working together as a crew, Phillips said. Zimmerman quoted Mean Joe Green expressing both the team's genuine deep respect for the Houston Oilers as well as its own supreme confidence of not needing breaks to win. He said, I felt bad for Houston. I didn't see the play. I was hoping it was the correct call. I can't take any satisfaction in that call. You have 22 players out there waiting for a decision to be made, and you don't get it. That's all you need, a decision, but where was it? Lynn Swann says you have to ask the rhetorical question, just like in Super Bowl 13 when we got the benefit of an official's call against Dallas. Wouldn't we have come back and played well enough to score again and win? I think we would have. Now, Pittsburgh area sports writer Jim Wexell, who has written about the Steelers for decades, chronicled the 1979 team in his book, Tales from Behind the Steel Curtain, and contended the NFL Films footage shows Renfro attempting to secure a better grip while his feet were going out of bounds. The play had been called correctly, Wexell concluded. Venerable Houston sports writer John McClain plays it straight down the middle in a 1996 interview with Renfro, writing that Pete Rozelle indicated in essence the call was blown but wouldn't say so explicitly. Now, Renfro in his article was as adamant as ever, suggesting Tunney's crew deliberately made the wrong call out of fear. I got up from the snow and saw Mr. Orr's eyeballs about to pop out, and when he went to huddle with the other officials and the snowballs started raining down from the stands, I knew we were in trouble. If they had called it in our favor, it may have started a riot, Renfro continued then to insist. I've seen the play 1,000,000 times on sports shows. It was a one-handed catch. The ball stuck on my hand, and I brought it to my chest without any juggling. So, I think that when you look at this, For whatever bizarre reason, Renfro's pass became the standard bearer for instant replay to be brought into effect, while a much more egregious error, caught perfectly by the camera, Rob Lytle's fumble in the 1977 AFC Championship game, quickly faded to oblivion. Enberg, who called that game as well, didn't call things the same way against the Oakland Raiders, or for the Oakland Raiders, as he did the Houston Oilers. He first suggested that the play had been blown dead before the fumble. Then minutes later, conceded there was no question that Lytle fumbled the ball before he was either stopped cold or fell to the ground. Oakland, a team accustomed to controversial calls in so many games, didn't even protest hardly. Not like the Oilers did. And, Enberg never brought up a home field advantage. And Enberg never brought up the things he did against the Steelers that day. And I think perhaps that's because the Broncos, much like the Oilers, were a likable underdog. It was good for them to win. It was good for NBC if they won. And Dick Enberg didn't want to rip it because he didn't want the Oakland Raiders to win that game. So it's a lot different when you've got the Broncos as opposed to, maybe the Steelers getting screwed. When the Oilers are the team getting screwed, everybody wants to jump on board. Everybody wants the Oilers to win that game outside of Pittsburgh. Now, Don Shula, who was one of the guys in the competition committee, told Banks it was the Renfro pass that apparently was the difference maker in the NFL's long march to instant replay, which didn't happen until years later. It was actually, I think, 5-6 years later before you got that. And Shula said it was the fact that people sitting in their homes, in their living room, could see that the call was blown on the field, see that it was missed, and yet the referees couldn't get the information and use it to fix the call. We were finally able to convince the owners that had to change. In all likelihood, the Steelers would want to play reversed equally as much as, if not more than the Oilers, I think, when you look back at this in hindsight. This wasn't an upstart needing a tuck rule gift. This was a powerhouse intent on dominating with no excuses. The 1979 Steelers were quite possibly, to that point, the greatest team in NFL history. In that season, injuries took a serious toll on this team, and unlike many other great teams, they did not protect the football, but they just bombarded opponents with Terry Bradshaw, throwing the ball to John Stallworth, Lynn Swann. You still had Rocky Bleier and Franco Harris in the backfield. Yet the team enjoyed its greatest domination of any of the championship years, marked by a frightening midseason rampage that they had through quality opponents like Denver, Dallas, Washington, all top quality teams. And, while they were an extraordinarily popular franchise, remember in 1972-73, the Steelers were the upstart that America loved. They hadn't been in a playoff game 30 or 40 years in 1972 when they won that game off Franco Harris's immaculate reception. But when you get to 1979, I think Steeler fatigue had set in. And the Houston Oilers were a great story. But maybe the best story of all this is Terry Bradshaw, which is a guy that you never hear mentioned about when you talk about the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And he had an utterly brilliant performance in the 1979 AFC Championship game. And, Bradshaw called his own plays. And in that game, there's so many times where he inverts a long third down and makes pinpoint passes. And somehow, Merlin Olsen insisted in the fourth quarter. I have to say, though, if I were picking my player of the game right now, it would be Dan Pastorini. I think he's been the most impressive player on the field. Let that sink in. His player of the game was Dan Pastorini, who completed 4 passes to wide receivers all day. Now, Dan Pastorini is a class act. I've interviewed him on the Legends show. He's a great guy. But he's not Terry Bradshaw. And on this day, he wasn't Terry Bradshaw. And in no world is he ever Terry Bradshaw. And you could just see the kind of Steeler fatigue in the announcers' voices. in the way, if you watch this game, I think it's on YouTube, I think you can find it on there too, you could hear the almost overt cheering of the NBC guys for the upstart underdog Houston Oilers. And I can see why. I've interviewed and met probably 7 or 8 guys on that team. They are high-class individuals. Bum Phillips is one of the most underrated football coaches of all time. All of his players loved him. I was cheering for the Houston Oilers that year. I was upset about the Renfro catch, but if you go watch the NFL Films version where you can see he doesn't have the ball secured. So in the end, when you look at this, even if they gave him a touchdown, the Pittsburgh Steelers were better, and they were going to win the game. So that is it for On This Day, January 6, 1980, and the controversial Mel Renfro touchdown. Yeah, not a touchdown call. And don't let the announcers tell you what your eyes can see. But remember, you can catch us on This Day every day on thegruelingtruth.com. You can follow us on Twitter at GruelingTruth. We will be back tomorrow with another spine-tingling story of years past. But for now, this has been Mike Goodpaster, and you've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.